On the morning of November 4th, 1791, an army of the United States stood in a frozen meadow along a tributary of the Wabash River. 920 men, 52 officers, 8 pieces of field artillery. The largest military force the young republic had ever assembled in the field. By midday, 97 of every 100 soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. Think about that ratio. At Gettysburg, the bloodiest day of the Civil War, total casualties on both sides reached roughly 30%. At Little Bighorn, Custer's detachment suffered just under 50%. At Braddock's defeat on the Monongahela in 1755, the British column lost about 66% of its strength. The Battle of the Wabash exceeded all of them, 97.4%. Of the 920 men who stood in formation at dawn, exactly 24 walked away unharmed. In a single morning, 1/4 of the entire United States Army ceased to exist. This is not the story most Americans know. There are no monuments to it on the National Mall. No paintings hang in the rotunda. The men who died there were not memorialized in song or recited in classrooms. The battle has been almost completely buried beneath the noise of more dramatic, more flattering defeats. And yet, what happened in that wilderness clearing on November 4th, 1791, changed the United States more profoundly than any other military engagement of its first half-century. It created the cabinet. It established executive privilege. It forced the Militia Acts of 1792. It indirectly produced the Jay Treaty. It compelled the creation of the first professional standing army in American history. Every institutional structure that defines how the American military exists today traces its origin, in some way, to a frozen morning in the Ohio wilderness when a coalition of 9 indigenous nations executed the most lopsided tactical victory in the history of warfare on the North American continent. By the end of this video, you will understand how a force of roughly 1,400 warriors, drawn from nations that contemporary American newspapers dismissed as scattered savages, executed a coordinated joint arms encirclement that exceeded the tactical sophistication of any European army of the period. You will understand why 2 American generals, separated by a personal feud they refused to set aside, killed their own army before the first musket fired. You will understand the 15-minute window at dawn that determined the outcome before most soldiers had finished their breakfast. You will understand the marksman named William Wells, raised among the Miami after his capture as a boy, who systematically dismantled the American chain of command in the opening minutes of the engagement. And you will understand why this catastrophe, this most American of military disasters, is also the reason the modern American military exists in the form it does today. To understand how a republic born of revolutionary triumph stumbled into the worst defeat in its history, we have to step back to the year 1783, when the ink on the Treaty of Paris was barely dry and the geography of an entire continent was about to become a battlefield. The Treaty of Paris of 1783 ended the American Revolutionary War on terms remarkably favorable to the new United States. Great Britain conceded sovereignty over an enormous tract of land stretching west from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, north to the Great Lakes, and south to Spanish Florida. On paper, the United States doubled in size overnight. On paper, the entire Old Northwest, the future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, belonged to the federal government in Philadelphia. On paper. The indigenous nations who actually lived in that territory had not been party to the negotiations. They had not been consulted. They had not signed the treaty. As far as the Miami, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Wyandot, the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, The Seneca Cayuga and the Cherokee bands of the Old Northwest were concerned. The British had no authority to give away land that did not belong to them, to a government they did not recognize, for purposes that involved their own dispossession and destruction. Miami War Chief Little Turtle, Shawnee War Chief Blue Jacket, Delaware leader Buckongahelas, and the Lenape leader known as Captain Pipe rejected American sovereignty over the territory north and west of the Ohio River absolutely. They did not negotiate the boundary. They did not concede it. They drew their own line, and they made clear they would defend it. The American response was not diplomatic. It could not afford to be. The young United States, emerging from a war that had nearly bankrupted it, carried staggering debt. Under the Articles of Confederation, the federal government lacked the power to tax. Its primary asset, its only meaningful path to solvency, was the systematic survey and sale of Western land to incoming settlers and land speculators. Every acre of the Ohio country represented potential revenue. Every indigenous claim that delayed surveys, blocked roads, or threatened settlements directly threatened the financial survival of the federal government itself. This structural dependency on land sales meant that peace with the Western Confederacy was not, in practical terms, an option the federal government could pursue. Settlement had to advance. Surveys had to proceed. Land had to be cleared, sold, occupied, taxed. The indigenous nations standing in the way of this process had to be displaced, by treaty if possible, by force if necessary. Force became necessary almost immediately. Between 1780 and 1789, frontier violence along the Ohio River claimed approximately 1,500 lives. Settlers crossing into the Northwest Territory were attacked. Flatboats were ambushed. Isolated farmsteads were raided. The killing ran in both directions, and it ran continuously. Land speculators, Ohio Company investors, and the political constituencies that depended on Western expansion lobbied Philadelphia relentlessly. They demanded federal intervention. They demanded a military expedition that would crush indigenous resistance and open the territory once and for all. In October 1790, President George Washington and Secretary of War Henry Knox authorized that expedition. They placed it under the command of Brigadier General Josiah Harmar. Harmar marched north from Fort Washington, the federal garrison at the site of modern Cincinnati, with roughly 1,500 men. His objective was the Miami capital of Kekionga, near the confluence of the rivers that form the Maumee. Harmar's army reached Kekionga. It burned the abandoned town. And then, in a series of confused engagements over several days in late October, Harmar's forces were ambushed and routed by a coalition led by Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. The Americans lost roughly 200 dead. The expedition limped back to Fort Washington, broken. Harmar's defeat did not pacify the Northwest Territory. It did the opposite. It announced to every indigenous community across the Old Northwest that the United States Army could be beaten in the field. It validated the militant faction within the Western Confederacy. It accelerated the raids. It hardened the resistance. It transformed what had been an episodic frontier conflict into something approaching organized war. Philadelphia's response was to organize a second expedition, larger, better equipped, better led, built around a campaign of methodical advance, the construction of permanent military outposts at regular intervals, and the destruction of the Maumee River towns that served as the political and logistical center of the Confederacy. The man Washington chose to command this second expedition was Major General Arthur St. Clair, then serving as the governor of the Northwest Territory. St. Clair was 54 years old. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War. He was, by background and temperament, an administrator rather than a field commander. He was also, in the autumn of 1791, suffering from advanced gout, a condition that left him in chronic, agonizing pain and frequently incapable of mounting a horse without assistance. He was about to lead an army of 2,000 men into the wilderness against an enemy he profoundly underestimated. In the summer of 1791, while St. Clair was still struggling to assemble the army Washington and Knox had promised him, a subordinate officer named James Wilkinson made a decision that would shape everything that followed. Wilkinson was a lieutenant colonel. He was ambitious. He was, as later evidence would prove, also a paid Spanish agent, though that particular treason remained undiscovered during his lifetime. In early August 1791, with St. Clair's main force not yet mobilized, Wilkinson led a preemptive raid into the heart of Miami territory. The stated purpose was to disrupt the planting cycle, force the Confederacy onto the defensive, and buy time for the federal expedition to organize. The unstated purpose was personal glory. The War Department had authorized the raid earlier in the year. Wilkinson led a force of more than 500 mounted Kentucky volunteers north from Fort Washington on August 1, 1791. They struck the Miami town of Kennepecamacqua along the Eel River on August 7th. They killed 9 indigenous men, women, and children. They burned villages, they destroyed standing crops, and they took 34 prisoners. Among the prisoners was a young woman, the daughter of Miami Chief Little Turtle. This detail, in any other context, might have been a footnote. In the political situation of the Western Confederacy in the spring of 1791, it was a detonator. In the weeks before Wilkinson's raid, several indigenous leaders had been actively debating whether to pursue peace negotiations with the United States. The militant faction, led by Blue Jacket of the Shawnee and Buckongahelas of the Delaware, argued for continued resistance. The accommodationist faction, drawing support from elements of the Wyandot and Iroquois, argued that the demographic tide could not be reversed, that some negotiated settlement was preferable to total war. The debate was not resolved. The future direction of the Confederacy hung on it. Wilkinson's raid ended the debate. The capture of Little Turtle's daughter was an act that no leader of standing could ignore or accept. The destruction of villages that had not been actively at war erased the distinction between hostile and neutral indigenous communities. The killings hardened every faction within the Confederacy into a single position: resistance to the death. Within weeks, the Western Confederacy held a war council on the Maumee. The accommodationists fell silent. The militants achieved consensus. Runners moved between villages from the Wabash to Lake Erie, carrying the same message. The Americans were coming. The Americans had to be stopped. The Confederacy would meet them as a unified army. Little Turtle, whose daughter was now a prisoner in American hands, became the principal tactical commander. Wilkinson's raid had not weakened the Confederacy. It had created it. The Western Confederacy that gathered along the Maumee in the summer and fall of 1791 was not what American newspapers described. It was not a collection of scattered war bands. It was not a disorganized rabble of savages lashing out in random violence. It was a coalition. The numbers tell part of the story. Approximately 1,400 warriors gathered for the campaign against St. Clair. They came from 9 distinct nations. The Shawnee contributed roughly 300. The Delaware, also called the Lenape, contributed 300. The Wyandot brought 200. The Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi together fielded approximately 400. The Miami contributed 100. The Seneca Cayuga of the Iroquois Confederacy contributed 75. A small Cherokee contingent of about 25 completed the alliance. But the numbers, by themselves, do not capture what made this force dangerous. What made the Western Confederacy dangerous was its organization. The coalition operated under a unified command structure. Blue Jacket of the Shawnee held overall political and military authority. Little Turtle of the Miami served as the principal tactical planner. Buckongahelas of the Delaware commanded a major contingent and shared in strategic decisions. Captain Pipe of the Lenape coordinated the eastern nations. Beneath this senior leadership, individual war chiefs commanded their own contingents. But those contingents operated according to a coordinated battle plan agreed upon in council and rehearsed before the campaign began. The warriors themselves were not amateurs. The vast majority were experienced combatants. They had fought through the Revolutionary War, in many cases on the British side, where they had learned both indigenous and European military doctrine. They had fought against Harmar the year before. They had fought against settler militias for a decade. They were, by 1791, among the most combat-tested soldiers on the North American continent. Their tactical doctrine combined elements that no European army of the period could match. They were superb individual marksmen. They moved silently through forest terrain. They used cover instinctively. They could shift from concealment to mass attack, to dispersed skirmishing within minutes. They understood the psychological effect of sudden, coordinated, multi-directional fire. And critically, they had developed a specific tactical formation for engaging European-style armies in woodland terrain, the encirclement crescent. The crescent worked like this. A center body of warriors would attack frontally to fix the enemy's attention and force them into defensive formation. While the center engaged, two wings would sweep around the flanks at speed, using the forest cover to mask their movement. Once the wings closed behind the enemy, the formation completed a full envelopment. From that point, every American musket inside the ring faced fire from multiple directions simultaneously. There was no rear. There was no flank. There was no direction in which retreat could be ordered, because every direction was the enemy. Little Turtle had used a version of this formation against Harmar in 1790. Against St. Clair, he intended to execute it in full, with 3 times the warriors and against a target that was already, before the battle began, in a state of operational collapse. The army that Major General Arthur St. Clair assembled in the summer and autumn of 1791 was a disaster waiting to be detonated. Every element of it, from recruitment to training to supply to leadership, was in some state of structural failure. The War Department had planned for a force of 4,000 men. The actual recruitment fell catastrophically short. Funding constraints, low pay, terrible reputation from Harmar's defeat, and competing demand from frontier militias produced an army of roughly 2,000 at its absolute peak. Of those 2,000, only 600 were regulars in the formal sense. 800 were 6-month levies, men enlisted for a single campaign season with minimal training and weak unit cohesion. 600 were state militiamen, many of whom had been pressed into service involuntarily and would desert at the first opportunity. The men themselves were, by the standards of any professional army, unsuitable for the campaign. Many were recent immigrants who spoke little English. Many were drawn from urban poverty in eastern cities, with no experience of wilderness conditions. Many were drunk on arrival at Fort Washington and remained so throughout the march north. Pay was in arrears, frequently by months. Uniforms were inadequate for the autumn cold. Food was insufficient, irregular, and often spoiled. The supply situation was worse. The Quartermaster General's Department, under Samuel Hodgdon, was a study in administrative collapse. Small arms arrived at Fort Washington broken, rusted, or with missing components. Cartridge boxes shipped from West Point arrived covered in mold so thick that the leather had to be scraped clean before use. Powder was damp. Flints were inferior. The basic engineering tools required to cut a wagon road through the forest and construct defensive outposts were available in numbers far too small for the work required. Autumn rains and early frosts compounded the supply failure. The grain that was supposed to feed the Army's pack animals spoiled in transit or rotted in storage. The pack horses, undernourished and overworked, died in numbers that progressively reduced the Army's transport capacity. By October, the supply train was a fraction of its planned size, and what remained struggled to keep pace with the marching column. Desertion ran continuously. Men slipped away in pairs and small groups every night. The militia, with their loose enlistment terms and their distance from home, deserted in the highest numbers. The levies followed. Even some of the regulars deserted, though in smaller proportions. To track what happened to the force, consider the steady arithmetic of attrition. At initial assembly in early September 1791, the Army numbered approximately 2,000 active combatants, accompanied by roughly 400 non-combatant camp followers. By the time the column departed Fort Washington in mid-September, the active force had fallen to roughly 1,486, with 200 to 250 followers. After the construction of Fort Hamilton and Fort Jefferson, which required leaving garrisons behind, the field force dropped to approximately 1,120. By the eve of battle on November 30, after a final cascade of detachments and desertions, the active combat strength stood at 920. 52 officers, 868 enlisted men and militia, roughly 200 to 250 camp followers, primarily the wives and children of soldiers, alongside laundresses and sutlers. The final blow to combat strength came on October 31st, 4 days before the battle. Approximately 60 Kentucky militiamen deserted in a single body. They announced their intention openly. They were going to plunder the Army's incoming supply wagons before vanishing into the frontier. St. Clair's response was operationally catastrophic. He detached his entire 1st Infantry Regiment, approximately 300 experienced regulars, to pursue the deserters and protect the supply convoys. The 1st Infantry was the only fully professional, fully trained, fully disciplined unit in the entire Army. St. Clair sent it away. He sent it away 4 days before he led the remaining force into an engagement against a coalition that had been waiting for him for weeks. What remained at the camp on the night of November 3rd was an army composed almost entirely of raw levies, untrained recruits, and militia who had already demonstrated a tendency to desert under pressure. The veterans were gone. The professionals were gone. The men who might have held formation under fire were gone. St. Clair did not seem to grasp what he had done. There is one more element to the American collapse, and it sits at the level of command itself. Arthur St. Clair, in the autumn of 1791, was not a healthy man. His gout had progressed to a stage where movement caused him severe pain. There were days during the march when he could not mount his horse. There were nights when he could not sleep. His staff had to lift him into and out of his camp bed. He commanded the army from a litter on several days of the advance. He commanded from his tent on others. This was not concealed from the troops. They saw their general carried. They saw his pain. They knew, in the way armies always know, that the man at the top of their chain of command was physically broken before the enemy had even been encountered. Worse, the relationship between St. Clair and his second-in-command, Major General Richard Butler, had collapsed into a state of total dysfunction. Butler was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was experienced, capable, and proud. He had expected the field command of the expedition for himself. When it went to St. Clair instead, Butler nursed the slight. As the campaign progressed, the relationship between the two senior officers degenerated from professional coolness into open hostility, and finally into a state of refusal to communicate directly with one another. They passed messages through aides. They avoided one another in council. They held separate dinners, separate conferences, separate operational pictures. An army in the field cannot function under this condition. Information that one general possesses must reach the other. Decisions one general makes must be coordinated with the other. The two-man feud at the top of St. Clair's command made coordinated action impossible. It meant, in practical terms, that the army had no functioning unified command at all. The result of this dysfunction would arrive in the small hours of November 4th. On the afternoon of November 3rd, 1791, St. Clair's column reached a stretch of high ground along a tributary that he believed to be the St. Mary's River. He was wrong. The watercourse was actually a tributary of the Wabash. The error in identification would not be discovered until after the battle, when survivors compared maps and realized how deep into hostile territory the army had actually penetrated. The campsite St. Clair selected was a narrow, elevated meadow. It was not large enough to accommodate the entire force in a single defensive position. This fact should have prompted a halt, a search for better ground, or at minimum, a careful tactical organization of the available space. Instead, St. Clair divided his command. The regulars and the levies camped on the eastern bank of the stream, in a tight rectangular formation on the meadow itself. The Kentucky militia were sent across the stream and ordered to camp on a separate elevated ridge to the west. This put roughly 300 poorly trained, poorly disciplined men in a forward position, separated from the main body by a watercourse, on ground that offered no defensive depth and no support from the artillery on the east bank. No breastworks were constructed, no defensive trenches were dug, no abatis, the felled tree obstacle that Revolutionary War armies had used routinely, was prepared. No felled timber, no earthen ramparts, nothing. President Washington's written orders to St. Clair, delivered before the campaign began, had contained an explicit warning. The orders specifically directed St. Clair to beware of surprise and to fortify his camp every night. Washington, who had served on the Monongahela in 1755 and witnessed Braddock's destruction firsthand, knew exactly what happened to European armies that camped without fortification in indigenous territory. He had told St. Clair, in writing, what to do. St. Clair did not do it. The reasons given afterward varied. The men were exhausted. The engineering tools were insufficient. The ground was too hard. The march would resume in the morning. None of the reasons were adequate. The omission was a violation of explicit standing orders issued by the President of the United States, in writing before the campaign began. That night, the camp settled into the quiet routines of military bivouac. Cook fires burned. Sentries posted at intervals around the perimeter. Officers ate in their tents. Camp followers, the wives and children of the soldiers, the laundresses, the sutlers, drew water from the stream and prepared what food remained. The temperature dropped. A heavy frost began to form on the ground and on the canvas of the tents. In the darkness beyond the perimeter, 1,400 warriors were already in position. Sometime after midnight, Captain Jacob Slough of the levies led a small scouting party out of the camp to investigate reports from sentries that indigenous scouts had been spotted moving through the trees. Slough's patrol pushed perhaps a quarter-mile into the forest. They encountered movement. They saw figures. They realized, with mounting certainty, that they were not looking at a few scouts. They were looking at the leading elements of a large war party in concealed positions around the camp. Slough's men withdrew silently. They returned to the encampment. Slough reported directly to Major General Richard Butler. He told Butler what he had seen. He told Butler that a massive attack was imminent. He requested that the commanding general be informed and that the camp be brought to alert. Butler did nothing. He did not wake St. Clair. He did not order the camp to alert. He did not double the sentries. He did not deploy a single additional picket. He did not request reinforcement of the militia position across the stream. He thanked Slough for the report, dismissed him, and went back to bed. The historical record does not preserve Butler's exact reasoning. The most likely explanation, supported by the broader pattern of his behavior during the campaign, is that he was unwilling to disturb St. Clair's sleep, unwilling to share intelligence with a commander he had ceased to communicate with, and unwilling to admit that his subordinate had produced information his own staff had failed to obtain. Personal grievance overrode professional duty. Whatever the precise motive, the outcome was definitive. The most senior tactical warning the American Army received before the battle, accurate, specific, delivered in person by an officer who had seen the enemy with his own eyes, was suppressed by the Army's second-in-command for reasons that amounted to a personal feud. St. Clair slept in his tent, unable to walk, drugged with whatever painkillers the Army's surgeons had available, while the camp around him remained in standard bivouac. The Kentucky militia slept on their exposed ridge across the stream. The regulars slept in their tight rectangles on the eastern meadow. The camp followers slept among the supply wagons in the center. The 8 pieces of field artillery sat in their unprotected positions on the perimeter. Across the dark forest, Little Turtle's warriors moved into final assault positions. The center, the Shawnee and the Delaware and the Miami, formed up directly opposite the Kentucky militia camp. The right wing, the Wyandotte and the Seneca Cayuga, eased into position to envelop the eastern flank of the main camp. The left wing, the Ottawa and the Ojibwe and the Potawatomi, took up positions to envelop the western flank. The crescent closed, the trap was set, the frost thickened on the meadow grass. Dawn approached. At first light on November 4th, 1791, the American Army stood down from reveille and began the routine of morning camp. Cook fires were rekindled. Soldiers stacked their muskets and moved to draw rations. Officers gathered for breakfast. The militia across the stream began the same routine. No special precautions had been taken. No alert had been raised. The intelligence Slough had delivered to Butler hours earlier had not been transmitted to any soldier outside Butler's immediate staff. The assault began at the militia camp. The center of the Western Confederacy's crescent, perhaps 700 warriors led by Blue Jacket and the senior Shawnee and Delaware commanders, erupted from the forest cover on the west side of the stream. The attack was sudden, coordinated, and overwhelming. Volleys of musket fire cut through the militia camp at point-blank range. War cries rose from the trees on 3 sides. Within seconds, men who had been pouring water into kettles or unrolling blankets were dead on the ground. The militia did not fight. They did not form a line. They did not return fire in any coordinated way. They broke. They abandoned their weapons. They abandoned their officers. They abandoned their camp entirely. In a wave of pure terror, hundreds of men sprinted east across the stream toward the main camp, splashing through the cold water, climbing the muddy bank, and crashing into the rectangular formations of the regulars and levies on the eastern meadow. This was the first catastrophic failure of the morning, and it took place in the first 3 minutes of the battle. The militia did not just abandon their position. They actively destroyed the defensive integrity of the main camp by crashing into it as a panicking mob. Officers trying to form their units into firing lines found those lines fouled by hundreds of routed militiamen, many of whom were unarmed, all of whom were screaming, none of whom were under any kind of control. The regular formations could not deploy. The artillery could not be brought to bear without firing through the militia. The camp, in the critical opening minutes when a coherent defense might have been organized, dissolved into chaos. Inside 15 minutes, the wings of the crescent closed. The Wyandotte and Seneca Cayuga on the right swept around the eastern flank. The Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi on the left enveloped the western flank. The crescent became a complete circle. From every point of the compass, indigenous warriors moved into firing positions in the surrounding forest, dropped to one knee or to the ground behind cover, and began a sustained, accurate, lethal fire into the American camp. The Americans were arrayed in tight defensive squares. This was the deployment European doctrine prescribed for receiving cavalry attacks on open ground. It was approximately the worst possible formation for receiving aimed rifle fire from concealed positions in dense forest. The American formations presented enormous, packed, stationary targets. Indigenous marksmen, firing from behind trees at ranges as short as 40 yards, could not miss. Every shot found a target. Many shots passed through one body to wound or kill a second. The American return fire was almost entirely useless. The soldiers fired in volleys, in unison, by command. They aimed at the tree line because they could not see individual targets. The musket balls struck trees, struck branches, struck nothing. The smoke from each volley rose into the cold morning air and hung in the still atmosphere, further obscuring the soldiers' vision. The warriors in the trees, firing individually and aimed, were dropping shots into the soldiers' formations at a rate the American volley fire could not match by an order of magnitude. There was a man in the indigenous line that morning whose presence requires a moment of attention, because his actions in the first half hour of the battle decided the engagement before any tactical maneuver could be attempted. His name was William Wells. Wells had been born in Kentucky. As a boy of about 13, he had been captured in a Miami raid and taken north into the Ohio country. He had been adopted into the Miami Nation. He had grown up among them. He had learned their language, their hunting methods, their warfare. By 1791, he was in his early 20s, married into the family of Little Turtle, and counted among the most accomplished marksmen of the Miami Nation. He spoke fluent English. He had served as a scout and translator. He knew, with intimate precision, how American military formations were organized, how American officers dressed, how American chains of command operated. On the morning of November 4th, Wells led a group of selected marksmen positioned for one specific tactical purpose: to identify and eliminate American officers and artillery crew. Officers in the United States Army of 1791 were instantly identifiable on the battlefield. They wore distinctive uniforms with elaborate epaulets, sashes, and headgear that marked them apart from enlisted men. They carried swords rather than muskets. They rode horses while the infantry stood on foot. They gave orders in voices that carried across formations. They were, by every visual and behavioral indicator, the most conspicuous targets on the battlefield. Wells and his marksmen began to shoot them. The first to fall were the artillery officers. The American battery, 8 pieces of field artillery, had been positioned in fixed locations around the perimeter of the eastern camp. In a conventional European battle, on open ground against an enemy advancing in lines, those guns would have been decisive. They could fire canister and grape shot, loads of dozens of musket ball-sized projectiles that turned each cannon into an enormous shotgun capable of devastating infantry at close range. The guns never had the chance. Within 30 minutes of the opening fire, nearly every artillery officer and every trained gun crew member lay dead or dying around their pieces. Wells's marksmen had identified them by their uniforms, by their positions, by their behavior at the guns. and had picked them off one by one with aimed fire from concealed positions. The cannons themselves were intact. The powder was available. The ammunition was beside them. But the men who knew how to fire them were dead. Infantry soldiers tried to take over the guns. They did not know how. They did not understand fuses. They did not understand elevation. They did not understand the proper loading sequence for canister versus solid shot. The guns they managed to fire were elevated incorrectly, sending grape shot and canister harmlessly over the heads of the warriors crouched in the forest, scything through the treetops, killing nothing. After a few minutes, the surviving crews spiked their own guns and abandoned them. The artillery, which should have been the decisive American advantage on the battlefield, contributed essentially nothing to the engagement. It was neutralized by a small group of marksmen who understood exactly which uniforms to shoot at. The same systematic targeting destroyed the American chain of command. Major General Richard Butler, the Army's second in command, the man who had suppressed Slough's warning the night before, was shot in his tent in the opening minutes of the battle. He was wounded badly. He was carried to a position behind some baggage. He was shot again. He died there, on the ground, the first of 4 American generals who would be killed in the Indian Wars of this period. 45 of the 52 officers engaged that morning would be killed or wounded before noon. 39 of them would be dead by the time the battle ended. The American Army, in addition to losing the engagement, lost its officer corps almost in its entirety in a single morning. There is a moment in the battle that captures, more than any other, how the entire engagement unfolded. Arthur St. Clair, despite his gout, despite his inability to walk unaided, despite the agonizing pain that had kept him bedridden for days, rose from his cot and demanded to be helped onto a horse. He had to command. He had to be seen. He had to try. His staff lifted him into the saddle. He rode out into the camp. He rode toward the chaos at the perimeter. He shouted orders to officers who could not hear him over the noise of musket fire and screaming men. He tried to rally formations that no longer existed as formations. He tried to organize a counterattack against an enemy he could not see, in a direction that was every direction at once. His horse was shot out from under him. His staff helped him onto another horse. That horse too was shot. By the end of the battle, his clothing had been pierced by musket balls in 8 separate places. Locks of his hair had been shot away. His hat had been pierced. He should have been dead. He survived for one reason, and the reason matters because it illustrates the indigenous tactical discipline that won the battle. William Welles's marksmen, the men responsible for targeting officers, did not recognize St. Clair as a senior commander. He was not wearing his general's uniform. He was wearing a plain coat, the same kind worn by junior officers and senior NCOs. In the absence of identifying insignia, in the chaos of the engagement, Welles's marksmen did not single him out. They shot at officers they could identify. St. Clair, indistinguishable from his subordinates by appearance, escaped systematic targeting. This detail would matter later. Anthony Wayne, when he rebuilt the American Army the following year, would order his officers to dress identically to their enlisted men for precisely this reason. He had learned, from St. Clair's accidental survival, what indigenous marksmen could do when officers were visually distinguishable. He would not give them that advantage again. But that lesson lay in the future. On the morning of November 4th, 1791, the lesson had not yet been learned. American officers in distinctive uniforms continued to die at an accelerating rate. Their men, without orders, without leadership, without coordinated direction, milled in the center of the camp like cattle in a slaughter pen. The American Army was not entirely passive. There were moments of attempted resistance, of officers and men trying to take action. The most significant came from Colonel William Dark, who commanded a battalion of levies on the western edge of the camp. Dark ordered his battalion to fix bayonets. He gathered perhaps 200 men. He ordered a charge directly into the center of the indigenous position to his front, the position from which the heaviest fire was coming. The charge succeeded, in the narrow tactical sense, for the first 30 or 40 yards. The warriors directly in front of Dark's battalion did not stand and fight. They did exactly what indigenous forest doctrine prescribed for receiving a bayonet charge from a heavier formation. They faded back. They moved through the trees. They withdrew without offering close combat, while continuing to fire from the flanks at the exposed sides of the charging column. Dark's men pushed forward. They had broken the immediate line in front of them. They had pierced the perimeter of the encirclement. For a few minutes, in the chaos of the morning, it might have seemed that the charge had succeeded. Then the momentum stalled. The men who had charged were exhausted. They had no support to their flanks. They had been firing on the move and were low on ammunition. The line of warriors that had faded back had not been destroyed. It had simply moved. When the charge stopped, the warriors closed in. What followed was brutal hand-to-hand combat in which the indigenous forces held every advantage. They were fresh. They were fighting in formation. They knew the ground. They had the numbers. The American levies, exhausted and isolated, were cut down in detail. Dark himself survived, severely wounded. Most of his battalion did not. The charge that had briefly opened a gap in the encirclement closed behind them and destroyed them in the same movement. The lesson was tactical, and Anthony Wayne would absorb it. Bayonet charges against indigenous forces in forest terrain accomplished nothing unless they could be sustained, supported, and exploited. A single isolated charge, however brave, simply offered the warriors an opportunity to commit one section of their force to absorbing the assault, while the rest of their force continued to fire into the disorganized American body that had launched it. By mid-morning, the eastern camp had become what survivors would describe, with appalling literal accuracy, as a slaughterhouse. The ground inside the perimeter, measuring perhaps 3.5 football fields in total area, was carpeted with bodies. Soldiers who had been shot stood briefly and fell again. Men crawled toward the center of the camp, dragging shattered limbs. The wounded screamed. The horses, terrified, ran in panicked circles, trampling the dead and the dying alike. Camp followers, the wives and children of the soldiers, had emerged from the wagons at the start of the battle and were now being killed in the open ground alongside the troops. The center of the camp, around the baggage wagons, had become a passive mass of men who had stopped fighting. They were not deserting. There was nowhere to desert to. They were not surrendering, because surrender was not an option that had been offered and would not have been honored if it had. They were simply huddling. They had given up on the formal defense of the perimeter and had retreated mentally and physically to the smallest possible space in the center of the killing ground. They stood there. They waited. The indigenous fire continued, unhurried, methodical, accurate. Survivors would describe the warriors as showing no apparent fear and no apparent urgency. They moved between firing positions at a walk. They reloaded carefully. They selected targets deliberately. They fired. They moved. They fired again. They were not in a frenzy. They were not out of control. They were executing a tactical operation that was producing exactly the result it had been designed to produce. And they had no reason to hurry. St. Clair, by this point, understood that the army was finished as a fighting force. The perimeter could not be held. The encirclement could not be broken by conventional means. The men in the center of the camp would not return to firing positions even if ordered. Within an hour, perhaps 2 at the outside, every American in the camp would be dead, wounded, or captured. The only option remaining was a breakout. St. Clair gathered the senior officers who were still alive and capable of receiving orders. The number was small. He explained what he intended. A concentrated bayonet charge, drawn from the remaining regulars and the few intact units of levies, would be assembled in the southern portion of the camp. The charge would aim southward, along the road they had constructed during the advance, the road that ran back 29 miles to Fort Jefferson. The objective was not victory. The objective was to punch a hole in the encirclement wide enough for the survivors to flow through. The wounded would be left behind. The artillery would be left behind. The baggage would be left behind. The camp followers, those who could keep up, would follow the column. Those who could not would be abandoned. Colonel Dark, despite his wounds from the failed earlier charge, would lead the breakout. The remaining regulars formed up. Perhaps 200 men, far fewer than St. Clair would have wanted, but the only force he had. They fixed bayonets. They moved into position at the southern perimeter. They waited for the order. The charge went forward at a full run. What happened next was, in its way, the most revealing tactical moment of the entire engagement. The indigenous warriors at the southern perimeter, who had been firing into the camp from concealed positions for nearly 3 hours, watched the bayonet charge come at them. They could have closed in. They could have committed reserves to the breakout point. They could have ensured the destruction of the column as it tried to break free. They did not. The warriors at the southern perimeter, under orders from the senior commanders, allowed the charge to pass through. They withdrew from their firing positions. They opened a gap. They permitted the column of approximately 300 regulars and levies and camp followers to break out of the encirclement and onto the road back toward Fort Jefferson. This was deliberate. This was Little Turtle's tactical doctrine in operation. The indigenous force at the Wabash had achieved its objective. The American army had been destroyed as a coherent fighting force. The American advance into the Maumee country had been stopped. Continuing to fight, to pursue the broken survivors, to destroy the last hundreds of men running south, would have cost warriors' lives for no additional strategic benefit. The plunder available in the abandoned American camp, 8 pieces of artillery, hundreds of muskets, supply wagons full of food and powder, thousands of pieces of equipment, was worth more to the Confederacy than the additional dead Americans would have been. The warriors who had fought through the morning broke off pursuit. They turned back toward the camp. They began to take what they had won. The flight south from the Wabash was not a retreat. The word implies organization, discipline, the maintenance of military formation. What happened after the breakout was a rout in its purest form. The survivors ran. They ran continuously, for hours, without stopping, without organization, without command. Men threw away their muskets to run faster. They threw away their cartridge boxes. They threw away their packs. They threw away their hats. Some threw away their coats. Some, when the road allowed it, threw away their shoes, judging that the friction and weight of the footwear cost them more speed than bare feet would. The road back to Fort Jefferson was 29 miles long. The survivors covered it in a single day, then continued past Fort Jefferson all the way south. Some made the full 90 miles back to Fort Washington without sleeping. They ran through cold rain. They ran through frost. They ran through the early winter darkness. They ran because the alternative was to stop, and to stop was to die. The wounded who could not keep up died. They died on the road. They died in the underbrush. They died crawling toward fires they could see in the distance. Some were killed by pursuing warriors who tracked the slowest stragglers for miles. Most simply collapsed from exhaustion, blood loss, or hypothermia, and were left behind. There is one survivor whose account preserves, with appalling clarity, what the morning and the flight looked like from the perspective of a participant. His name was Benjamin Van Cleve. Van Cleve was 18 years old in November 1790. He was not a soldier. He was a civilian packhorse driver employed by the Quartermaster General's Department at $15 a month to manage the Army's pack trains and drive cattle. He had been born in New Jersey. His family had come west and arrived at Cincinnati, then a frontier settlement of perhaps a few hundred people, in January 1790. His father, John Van Cleve, had been killed and scalped by a war party outside Cincinnati in June 1791, leaving Benjamin, then 18, as the primary support for his mother and younger siblings. On the morning of November 4th, Van Cleve was at the Army's pack train, near the wagons in the center of the camp. He saw the assault begin. He watched the militia run across the river. He watched the encirclement close. He watched the officers fall. He took up a musket. He fired what ammunition he had. And when the breakout came, he joined the column heading south. His written account is among the most vivid first-person descriptions of the engagement that survives. He describes throwing his bridle over a stump from which a tent pole had been cut, and turning to retreat a short distance, and watching his horse shot down in the same moment. He describes the ground being literally covered with the dead. He describes the warriors as showing no apparent fear of anything the Americans could do. He describes them as able to skip out of reach of a bayonet and return again as they pleased. The detail from Van Cleve's account that is lodged most permanently in the historical record concerns his flight. As Van Cleve ran south along the road, shoeless, exhausted, frozen, he passed slower men. He understood, with grim clarity, what was happening to those he passed. They would be caught. The warriors who were still pursuing would kill the slowest first. Each man who fell behind Van Cleve became, in a sense, a brief shield for the man ahead of him, because the time the warriors spent killing and scalping the slower man was time during which the faster man could increase the distance. Van Cleve wrote about this calculation with the directness of a young man who had survived something that should have killed him. He passed slower men. He calculated his odds. He did not stop to help them. He could not. To stop was to die. He made it to Fort Jefferson. He survived. He continued his work for the Army. The following year, the War Department sent him as a courier to Philadelphia with urgent dispatches. He met Henry Knox, the Secretary of War, in person. He quarreled with Knox over travel expenses, a small detail that survives in the record because Knox's response was preserved in the department's correspondence. Van Cleve, undeterred by the dispute, completed his mission, delivered horses to the Mohawk chief Joseph Brant in New York, and returned to Ohio. In 1796, at the age of 23, he accompanied the surveyor Israel Ludlow north along the Great Miami River to lay out the lots for a new settlement. The settlement was named Dayton. Benjamin Van Cleve became its first permanent civilian resident. He lived another quarter century in Dayton, raised a family there, and died in 1821. His memoir, written years after the events it describes, sat in family papers for generations before being published. It is, today, one of the foundational documents of frontier Ohio history. And it survives because an 18-year-old packhorse driver on the morning of November 4th, 1791, ran faster than the man behind him. By nightfall on November 4th, the surviving Americans had reached Fort Jefferson. The garrison there, perhaps 100 men, was overwhelmed. The fort had not been provisioned for the sudden arrival of several hundred starving, freezing, wounded refugees. The wounded who arrived alive began to die through the night from exposure, from blood loss, from shock. Some were placed in the fort's small log buildings. Many spent the night outside in the freezing rain, with only the clothes they had run in. By dawn on November 5th, St. Clair had reassembled what was left of his command. The survivors continued south the next day, leaving the wounded who could not travel at Fort Jefferson. The flight continued in stages all the way to Fort Washington. When the final accounting was done, the numbers told a story that contemporary observers struggled to believe. Of the 920 officers and men who had been in formation at dawn, 632 were dead, missing, or captured. Another 264 were wounded but had survived. 24 men, 24 out of more than 900, had emerged from the engagement physically unhurt. The officer corps had been annihilated. 39 of 52 officers were dead. 7 more were wounded. The combatant casualty rate was 97.4%. The camp followers had fared even worse. Approximately 200 to 250 wives, children, laundresses, and sutlers had been in the camp at dawn. Nearly all of them were killed, captured, or otherwise lost. The precise figure is uncertain because the record of camp followers was always loose. But contemporary accounts agreed that the survival rate for non-combatants approached 0. Indigenous casualties stood in vivid contrast. The Western Confederacy lost approximately 21 warriors killed and perhaps 40 wounded. The ratio of American to indigenous casualties exceeded 15-1. To set the Wabash against the other famous military defeats of the early American period. At Braddock's defeat in 1755, the British column had suffered approximately 66% casualties out of roughly 1,400 engaged. At Custer's Little Bighorn in 1876, the cavalry detachment had suffered approximately 50% casualties out of 647. The Wabash had exceeded both. It had not just exceeded them, it had nearly doubled the rate of the bloodiest comparable engagement in American military history. 1/4 of the entire standing United States Army of the period had been destroyed in a single morning by a force smaller than itself. The news traveled south at the speed of exhausted riders and lathered horses. It reached Fort Washington in mid-November. It reached Pittsburgh by the end of the month. It reached Philadelphia, the capital, on December 9th. President Washington was hosting a dinner that evening when an aide handed him the dispatch from St. Clair. Washington read it. He returned to his guests. He completed the dinner. After the guests had departed, he turned to his secretary, Tobias Lear, and unleashed what Lear would later describe as one of the most violent expressions of anger he had ever witnessed from the president. Washington had warned St. Clair, "Beware of surprise. Fortify your camp." The orders had been explicit. The orders had been written. They had been ignored. An entire army had been lost. The frontier was now defenseless. The Western Confederacy, victorious beyond any reasonable expectation, would press its advantage. Settlements would burn. Settlers would die. And the federal government, whose financial survival depended on the orderly settlement of the Northwest Territory, was now facing the possibility that the entire territorial project had been set back by years. Washington's anger, contained in private, gave way in the weeks that followed to systematic political action. The catastrophe at the Wabash demanded responses across multiple dimensions of the federal government. The institutional changes that followed shaped American government permanently. The first response was congressional. The House of Representatives, demanding accountability for a disaster of unprecedented scale, voted in March 1792 to launch an investigation. The investigation demanded access to original War Department records, including the orders Washington had issued to St. Clair, the correspondence between St. Clair and the War Department, and the internal deliberations of the executive branch concerning the campaign. This demand created a constitutional crisis the young republic had not previously confronted. What were the limits, if any, on Congress's ability to subpoena executive branch documents? Did the president have the authority to refuse? On what grounds? On March 31st, 1792, Washington convened a meeting of his 4 department heads: Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. They met to discuss the constitutional question presented by the House's demand for documents. When they returned with their unified position 2 days later, on April 2nd, the precedent had been set. This meeting was the first time the president had convened all 4 of his senior department heads together as a single deliberative body. It was the moment that established the cabinet as a functional institution of American government. The Constitution itself did not provide for a cabinet. The text mentions only that the president might require the opinions, in writing, of the principal officers of his executive departments. The cabinet as an institution, as a deliberative council of senior administrators who met regularly to consider executive policy, was an invention of the Washington administration, and it was invented, specifically and identifiably, in response to the political fallout from the Battle of the Wabash. The deliberations of that first cabinet meeting produced a second institutional innovation. Jefferson and Hamilton, working together despite their bitter personal and political rivalry, drafted the constitutional argument that became known as executive privilege. They concluded that the president possessed the authority to refuse to provide Congress with documents whose disclosure would compromise national security, ongoing diplomatic activity, or the public interest more broadly. The president, they argued, had not merely the practical ability, but the constitutional right to withhold information from congressional inquiry under certain circumstances. Executive privilege has been invoked in every American administration since. It has been the subject of Supreme Court rulings. It has shaped impeachment proceedings. It has defined the boundary between congressional oversight and executive autonomy. And the doctrine was invented, in its original form, in response to a congressional investigation of the destruction of an army in the Ohio wilderness in 1791. The congressional investigation itself, which concluded the following year, exonerated St. Clair personally of the specific allegations leveled against him. It assigned blame instead to systemic failures: the inadequacy of the Army's logistics, the failures of the Quartermaster General's Department, and the structural difficulties of mounting a frontier expedition with the resources Congress had provided. The investigation was thorough. It was honest. It produced findings that Congress did not particularly want to hear. And it established, as precedent, the principle that Congress had legitimate authority to investigate executive branch failures, even when the investigation embarrassed the administration in power. St. Clair himself resigned his commission. He retained his position as governor of the Northwest Territory until 1802, when President Jefferson removed him. He died in 1818, impoverished and largely forgotten, in western Pennsylvania. The second major institutional response was legislative. In May 1792, Congress passed 2 pieces of legislation collectively known as the Militia Acts. The first Militia Act authorized the president to call forth state militias into federal service to enforce federal law, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions. This was a substantial expansion of federal authority. Under the Articles of Confederation, and even under the early implementation of the Constitution, the relationship between federal authority and state militias had been ambiguous. The Militia Act made the relationship explicit. The president, in defined circumstances, could mobilize state forces under federal command. The Second Militia Act went further. It required all free, able-bodied white male citizens between the ages of 18 and 45 to enroll in their local militia, to provide their own weapons and equipment, and to muster for training on a regular schedule. This was a near universal military service requirement for adult white men. It was the foundation of American military manpower for the next century. The Civil War would draw its initial volunteer regiments from militias organized under the framework the 1792 Acts had established. The Spanish-American War would mobilize through the same framework. The system would not be fundamentally restructured until the National Defense Act of 1916. The Militia Acts were a response to a specific operational failure of the Wabash campaign. The inadequacy and unreliability of the militia component of St. Clair's army. If militia forces were to be the primary American military instrument on the frontier, they had to be organized. They had to be trained. They had to be subject to federal call-up under clear legal authority. The acts attempted to solve those problems. They were imperfect. They created tensions that would persist for generations. But they remade the American military system, and they were passed in direct response to the catastrophe at the Wabash. The third major response was international. When news of St. Clair's defeat reached London in early 1792, the British government's initial response was one of barely concealed satisfaction. British policy in the Old Northwest had long aimed at maintaining indigenous power as a buffer between American expansion and the British territories in Canada. The continued existence of independent indigenous nations along the Maumee and the Wabash served British strategic interests. It limited American settlement. It preserved the British fur trade. It maintained leverage that London could use in future negotiations. The destruction of St. Clair's army validated this strategy spectacularly. London began to develop plans for a permanent indigenous buffer state, a territory under nominal British protection that would block American expansion north of the Ohio River and west of the Appalachians indefinitely. Then, in February 1793, France declared war on Great Britain. The British strategic calculus changed overnight. Britain now needed friendly trading relations with the United States. Britain needed access to American grain to feed both its home population and its military forces. Britain could not afford a hostile United States on the western frontier of its own colonies while it was fighting a major war in Europe. The indigenous buffer state, attractive in peacetime, became a strategic liability in wartime. By 1794, Britain was actively seeking to defuse the conflict with the United States. The result was the Jay Treaty, negotiated by Chief Justice John Jay and signed in November 1794. The treaty addressed multiple outstanding disputes between the two nations. Most importantly for the Northwest Territory, Britain agreed to withdraw its military garrisons from forts on the American side of the Great Lakes border. Forts at Detroit, at Mackinac, at Niagara, that had remained in British hands since the end of the Revolutionary War, in direct violation of the Treaty of Paris. The withdrawal of those garrisons was decisive for the future of the Western Confederacy. The forts had been the primary source of indigenous military supply: muskets, powder, lead, blankets, the goods that made armed resistance to the United States possible. With the British forts withdrawn and the supply chain severed, the Confederacy lost its diplomatic backing and its material base simultaneously. The Jay Treaty was deeply unpopular in the United States for other reasons. It was denounced as a humiliating concession to British power. It nearly destroyed the Washington administration politically. But for the specific question of the Old Northwest, the treaty was decisive. It cut the Western Confederacy off from external support at exactly the moment when the United States was preparing a second, far more capable military expedition into the territory. That second expedition was the responsibility of Major General Anthony Wayne. Wayne was 47 years old in 1792, when Washington appointed him Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army following St. Clair's resignation. He was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, where he had earned the nickname Mad Anthony for his aggressive battlefield conduct at Stony Point and elsewhere. He was, by temperament, what St. Clair had not been. A fighting general, comfortable with discipline, comfortable with the use of force, and willing to spend the time required to build a competent army before he led it into the field. Wayne understood that the defeat at the Wabash had not been the result of bad luck. It had been the result of structural failures: training, supply, command, doctrine. None of those failures could be solved on a battlefield. They had to be solved in advance. They had to be solved through systematic preparation that would produce a different kind of army. Wayne's first decision was to remove the army from the social environment of the existing frontier garrisons. He established a new training cantonment along the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, far enough from Pittsburgh that the troops could not desert easily, far enough from the existing forts that the institutional culture of failure could not infect his new command. He called the cantonment Legionville. He spent more than 25 months there, training the men he had been given into the army he intended to lead. The unit Wayne built was called the Legion of the United States. The name was deliberate. It evoked the Roman legions, the combined arms, tactical organizations of the ancient world, in contrast to the European linear infantry tradition that had failed at the Wabash. Wayne stated his doctrinal principle directly: the only good lines are those nature made. The Legion would not fight in European linear formations. It would fight as the terrain and the enemy demanded. The Legion was organized into 4 sub-legions, each commanded by a brigadier general. Each sub-legion combined heavy infantry, cavalry, light artillery, and riflemen into a single integrated tactical unit capable of independent operation. The 4 sub-legions were distinguished by their uniform colors: white and black for the first, red and white for the second, black and yellow for the third, green and white for the fourth. Each sub-legion's cap trim, plume colors, and binding were coordinated to its sub-legion color. The first and second sub-legions were built around heavy infantry and dragoons. The third and fourth included specialized rifle companies trained for skirmishing and forest combat. Wayne implemented a series of specific tactical innovations, each of which addressed a specific failure of the Wabash campaign. He ordered that officers would wear uniforms identical to those of enlisted privates. The distinctive officer's dress, the marker that had allowed William Welles's marksmen to systematically eliminate the American chain of command, would no longer exist. An officer of the Legion, viewed from 100 yards through forest cover, would be indistinguishable from his men. Marksmen could not target what they could not identify. He modified the touch holes of the Charleville muskets issued to his light infantry. By enlarging and tapering the touch hole, Wayne's armorers created a self-priming mechanism. When a soldier rammed a powder cartridge into the barrel and seated the ball, a small amount of fine powder automatically spilled into the flash pan through the enlarged touch hole. The manual priming step, which required a soldier to halt, open his pan, dispense powder, close the pan, and shoulder his weapon, was eliminated. Wayne's soldiers could load and fire on the move at a trot, while keeping their formations under tension. He drilled his cavalry until they could load and fire their pistols and carbines at a full gallop using live ammunition. Most of the period's cavalry trained with blanks or with dry firing exercises. Wayne understood that horses unaccustomed to the noise and smoke of close-quarters gunfire panicked in combat, rendering the cavalry useless at the moment it was most needed. His cavalry, by contrast, trained with the real thing, until both horses and riders had become desensitized to the noise of point-blank firing. He instituted realistic mock combat exercises. Specialized rifle companies, painted and dressed to resemble indigenous warriors, attacked his line infantry in repeated sham engagements. The line infantry learned to hold formation against the appearance, the noise, and the tactics of a forest enemy. They learned to aim at individual men rather than firing blind volleys at tree lines. They learned to fix bayonets and countercharge immediately upon receiving an attack rather than waiting for orders that might not come. He replaced the heavy field artillery, the 8-pounder cannons that had been useless at the Wabash, with small mountain howitzers in 2.75 and 2.85-inch calibers. These weapons could be disassembled and carried on horseback. They could be brought into action wherever the terrain allowed a single pack horse to move. The crews drilled until they could assemble, load, and fire one of these howitzers every 15 seconds. The artillery would not, as St. Clair's had, be neutralized by being fixed in exposed positions on a perimeter. It would be mobile. It would be where it was needed. Wayne trained his army for 2 years. 2 years of drill, 2 years of mock combat, 2 years of building unit cohesion in a controlled environment away from the distractions and corruption of the frontier garrisons. By the end of 1793, the Legion of the United States was a different kind of army from the one St. Clair had led. It was perhaps the first genuinely professional standing army in the history of the United States. In late 1793, Wayne moved the Legion north from Pennsylvania into the Ohio country. He marched along the same road St. Clair had built 2 years earlier. He passed the locations of Fort Hamilton and Fort Jefferson. He continued, deliberately, to the site of St. Clair's defeat on the upper Wabash. There, on the ground that was still littered with the bones of 900 American soldiers, Wayne constructed Fort Recovery. The name was symbolic. It announced that the ground would be held, the defeat would be recovered from, the territory would not be abandoned. The construction of Fort Recovery prompted exactly the response Wayne had anticipated. In June 1794, more than 2,000 warriors of the Western Confederacy assaulted the fort directly. They struck at dawn, in much the manner they had struck St. Clair's camp. They expected, in some sense, to repeat the victory. They did not repeat it. The Legion's garrison, dug in behind the fort's walls, supported by mobile artillery, equipped with the modified muskets and trained in the new doctrine, held. They held through 2 days of continuous assault. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Confederacy. They demonstrated, in their first major engagement, that the institutional reforms Wayne had implemented had produced a fundamentally different American military instrument. 2 months later, on August 20th, 1794, Wayne brought the Legion to a decisive engagement with the main forces of the Western Confederacy near the Maumee Rapids. The battle was fought in a tract of forest where a tornado had felled large numbers of trees, creating a tangled mass of trunks and branches. The location gave the engagement its name, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Confederacy expected to use the terrain advantage. They expected to draw the Americans into close combat in the felled timber, where their forest doctrine would prevail. The Legion did not cooperate. Wayne's infantry pushed forward steadily, holding formation, using the bayonet, exploiting the mobile artillery to suppress indigenous positions. The cavalry swept around the indigenous flanks, exploiting the open ground beyond the fallen timber, using the training that had made them functional in close combat. The Legion's riflemen used the felled trees as cover for their own marksmen, neutralizing the indigenous advantage in concealment. The engagement was brief. Wayne's professional army defeated the Western Confederacy in approximately 90 minutes. The defeat was decisive in a way the Wabash had been decisive in reverse. The indigenous forces did not just lose the field, they lost their belief that the field could be won against the new American army. Following fallen timbers, the Confederacy retreated north to the British fort at Fort Miamis, expecting British military support. The British garrison closed its gates. They would not open them. The Jay Treaty negotiations were already underway. London had decided that the indigenous buffer state was no longer worth the cost of confrontation with the United States. The Confederacy, abandoned by its diplomatic patron, was finished. In August 1795, at Greenville in the Ohio country, the leaders of the Confederacy met with Wayne and signed the Treaty of Greenville. The treaty ceded most of the future state of Ohio to the United States. It established a boundary between American territory and the remaining indigenous lands. It accepted, in formal terms, the American conquest of the Old Northwest. Little Turtle was among the signatories. He had argued 2 years earlier that the Confederacy should accept negotiated peace with the United States rather than fighting to total defeat. He had been overruled then. Now, with the Confederacy broken at fallen timbers and the British walking away, his earlier judgment had been vindicated by events. He would live another 17 years, increasingly engaged with American leaders in efforts to preserve what could be preserved of indigenous life in the Old Northwest. He died in 1812, on the eve of another war between Britain and the United States, in which the Western Confederacy's surviving nations would attempt and fail to recover what they had lost. The bones at the Wabash remained where they had fallen. For nearly 60 years after the battle, the field was abandoned to the forest. Trees grew up among the buried equipment. Local settlers, when the territory was eventually opened to white settlement, knew the site only as a place where something terrible had happened. The exact location of the battlefield faded from precise memory. In 1851, 60 years after the engagement, boys playing along the upper Wabash discovered human bones eroding out of a stream bank. The bones were extensive. They covered an area that survivors of the battle brought to the site to confirm it, identified as the position of the American camp on the morning of November 4th, 1791. On September 10th, 1851, the community of Fort Recovery, Ohio, held a public reinterment ceremony. The remains, those that could be collected from the shallow graves where they had lain for 6 decades, were brought together. They were interred in what is now called Pioneer Cemetery. A small monument was placed there. The site is visited today primarily by local school children and military history enthusiasts. It is not on any major tourist route. It is not part of the national memory in the way Gettysburg or Antietam are part of the national memory. This anonymity is, in some sense, the final element of the Wabash story. The battle has been almost completely buried by the way Americans tell their own history. The reasons for this burial are worth examining, because they say something important about what national memory selects for and what it forgets. The Wabash failed several tests that determine which battles become part of national memory. It was a defeat, not a victory. National memory is overwhelmingly triumphalist. It preserves moments when the nation prevailed. It buries moments when the nation was humiliated, especially when the humiliation came at the hands of an enemy the national mythology has been organized to dismiss. It was a defeat at the hands of indigenous forces. American historical memory has consistently struggled to acknowledge indigenous military competence on its own terms. The Western Confederacy at the Wabash was not a horde. It was not a swarm. It was a sophisticated military organization that executed a coordinated joint arms operation against a numerically larger enemy and destroyed it. Acknowledging this requires acknowledging that the conventional narrative of indigenous resistance as a series of fragmented raids by primitive opponents who were inevitably overcome by superior American organization is wrong. The Wabash forces the question of whether American victory in the Old Northwest was a function of military superiority or of the eventual mobilization of overwhelming demographic and material resources to overcome an opponent that, at the tactical level, was equal or superior. It produced no obvious individual hero. Custer's last stand became a national memory, partly because Custer himself, however badly he had performed, became a usable symbol. The Wabash had no Custer. St. Clair was an old man, crippled by gout, who survived the engagement by accident. Butler died as a result of his own dereliction of duty. Darkey led a doomed bayonet charge. Wells, the indigenous marksman, was the most effective individual combatant on the field, and he was an American by birth who had been raised by the Miami. There was no figure whose story national memory could comfortably build around. It had no obvious territorial consequence. The campaign was eventually reversed by Wayne. The territory was eventually conquered. The settler advance proceeded. From a long-range perspective, the Wabash was a setback, not a turning point. National memory privileges battles that visibly changed the trajectory of history. The Wabash, viewed from a sufficient distance, looks like a delay. And the engagement itself was, in its tactical character, almost embarrassing. It was a slaughter. It was a one-sided destruction of an unprepared army by a prepared enemy. There were no maneuvers for school children to study, no formations to admire, no moments of conventional military glory. The battle was over by mid-morning. The remainder of the day was a rout. There was nothing in it that lent itself to the kind of heroic narrative that makes a battle memorable. For all these reasons, the Wabash has been almost completely buried beneath the surface of American national consciousness. It exists in the memory of professional military historians. It exists in the local memory of Mercer County, Ohio. It exists in the records of the United States Army, which still teaches the engagement in its officer training programs as a case study in the consequences of inadequate preparation. But it is not a battle that most Americans have heard of. It is not a name that most Americans recognize. It is not, in the public memory, what it actually was. The worst military catastrophe in the history of the United States. What does it mean to remember a battle like the Wabash? It means, first, acknowledging what the Western Confederacy actually accomplished. 1,400 warriors, drawn from 9 different nations, speaking multiple languages, operating without the institutional support of a state, executed a coordinated military operation that destroyed an army of the United States with a casualty ratio of 15-1. They did this not through luck and not through ambush, in the casual sense of the word, but through the systematic application of tactical doctrine that was, at the operational level, more sophisticated than the doctrine being practiced by the army they were fighting. This is not a story about indigenous victimhood. It is a story about indigenous military competence. The two stories are different. The first is the story that fits comfortably within the conventional American narrative of westward expansion. The second is much more difficult to integrate. It requires admitting that the Army of the United States in 1791 was not the most capable military force operating in the territory it claimed to control. It means, second, acknowledging the human cost on its full scale. 900 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. 200 camp followers, primarily women and children, were killed alongside them. the wives of soldiers who had followed the army into the wilderness, hoping to remain near their husbands, died in numbers that contemporary chroniclers did not even attempt to count precisely. They simply died. Their bodies were left where they fell. Their names, in most cases, were never recorded. It means, third, acknowledging the indigenous cost as well. Approximately 21 warriors died in the engagement. They were not nameless. They had families. They had communities. They had returned to their villages in the days after the battle as heroes, but they had also returned to grieving relatives. The Western Confederacy's losses were small in proportion, but they were not zero. The cost of preserving indigenous sovereignty in the Old Northwest was paid in indigenous blood as well as American blood. And the price would continue to be paid for another 2 decades after the Wabash, culminating in the comprehensive dispossession that the Treaty of Greenville and the subsequent treaties of the early 19th century would impose. It means, fourth, acknowledging the structural consequences. The institutional changes that followed the Wabash, the Cabinet, executive privilege, the Militia Acts, the Jay Treaty, the creation of the Legion of the United States, are foundational to the modern American state. They were not minor adjustments. They were major transformations of the way the federal government was organized and the way the American military functioned. They were forced into existence by the necessity of responding to a catastrophe that exceeded any military disaster the young republic had previously imagined. The lessons of the Wabash have been studied repeatedly by professional military analysts for 2 centuries. The first lesson is the cost of underestimating an enemy. St. Clair and the War Department behind him planned the campaign on the assumption that the Western Confederacy was a collection of war bands that would scatter when confronted with a large, organized force. The assumption was wrong. It was wrong factually, in the sense that the Confederacy was in fact an organized military coalition with a unified command structure. It was wrong doctrinally, in the sense that the indigenous forces had developed tactical methods that could neutralize the conventional advantages of a European-style army in forest terrain. And it was wrong politically, in the sense that the Confederacy possessed the organizational capacity to plan and execute a sustained campaign over months and years. The underestimation cost an army. The same kind of underestimation has cost other armies, in other contexts, repeatedly, across the centuries since. The second lesson is the importance of fortification. Washington's order to fortify the camp every night was not a bureaucratic detail. It was based on direct experience of what happened to European armies that camped without fortification in indigenous territory. A fortified camp with breastworks and abatis, even hastily constructed, would have changed the engagement fundamentally. The militia might have held. The artillery might have functioned. The initial penetration might not have collapsed the entire defensive position. The failure to dig the trenches and pile the earth that Washington had ordered was an unforced error the army did not recover from. The third lesson is the indispensability of unified command. The feud between St. Clair and Butler was not a personality problem. It was a tactical catastrophe. When Captain Slough delivered accurate warning of an imminent attack to the Army's second-in-command, that warning was not transmitted to the commanding general. It was suppressed. The reason was personal. The consequence was operational. The Army was attacked in conditions that, with appropriate alert, could have been mitigated. Without alert, the conditions were optimal for the enemy. An army that cannot internally communicate cannot function. The lesson has been learned repeatedly by armies before and since, and it remains one of the foundational principles of military organization at every level. The fourth lesson is the importance of training. The men St. Clair led into the field were untrained. The men Wayne led into the field 2 years later, after 25 months at Legionville, were trained. The difference against the same enemy on similar terrain produced opposite outcomes. The institutional change that produced the Legion of the United States was not a tactical change. It was an investment in time, money, and disciplined preparation. The investment was the price of military effectiveness. The Wabash demonstrated, in the most graphic possible way, what the alternative looked like. The fifth lesson is the importance of doctrine appropriate to terrain. European linear tactics, the doctrine St. Clair's officers had inherited from the Revolutionary War, were optimized for open ground against a similarly armed enemy in similar formations. They were almost perfectly inappropriate for forest combat against an enemy who used cover and dispersed marksmanship as primary tactical methods. The indigenous forces at the Wabash had developed doctrines suited to the terrain. The Americans had not. Wayne, in building the Legion, explicitly discarded European linear doctrine in favor of methods adapted to the actual conditions of the war he intended to fight. The lesson has been relearned repeatedly, often at similar cost. Doctrine that does not adapt fails. We began with a number, 97.4%. Of the 920 American officers and men who stood in formation at dawn on November 4th, 1791, 24 walked away unharmed. 96 of every 100 soldiers in the field that morning were killed, wounded, or captured before noon. We end with the same number, and with the recognition that the number itself is the story. A nation does not lose 97% of an army by accident. It loses 97% of an army because something has gone catastrophically wrong at every level of the institutional structure that produced the army, supplied the army, led the army, and ordered the army into the field. The Wabash was not a tactical failure. It was an institutional failure that happened to be visible on a battlefield. The Western Confederacy that destroyed St. Clair's army was not a horde. It was a coalition. Its leaders were experienced political and military figures with names and biographies and strategic objectives that they understood clearly. Little Turtle was not a primitive warrior. He was a tactical commander whose judgment, including his early skepticism of an open field engagement and his later willingness to negotiate peace, would have served any European army of the period. The men who died at the Wabash were not, in most cases, soldiers in any professional sense. They were levies. They were militia. They were recent immigrants pressed into a campaign they did not understand for objectives they could not have articulated. They died in a forest clearing in what is now Mercer County, Ohio, because the political class of their country had organized a campaign that was guaranteed to fail, and then sent them to execute it. The American military that exists today, the professional standing army with its emphasis on training, its integrated combined arms doctrine, its insistence on fortification and intelligence and unified command, exists because of what happened on that morning. The mistakes that destroyed St. Clair's army were so comprehensive and so visible that the institutional response to them produced a transformation of the American military system. Anthony Wayne's Legion was the first iteration of that transformed institution. Every reform that followed, through the War of 1812, through the Mexican War, through the Civil War, through the World Wars, built on the foundation that the destruction of St. Clair's army made possible. This is the strange, painful truth that the Wabash carries. The worst defeat in American military history was also the most productive. The army that died in the Ohio forest was the necessary condition for the army that succeeded it. The institutional failures that killed the men in the meadow forced the institutional reforms that made the modern American military possible. The bones of those men lie now in Pioneer Cemetery at Fort Recovery, Ohio. They lie in shallow graves that were dug 60 years after they died by farmers and townspeople who had stumbled upon them by accident. They have no individual markers. Their names, in most cases, were lost long ago. The camp followers, the wives and children and laundresses, lie with them, equally anonymous, equally forgotten. They do not appear on the National Mall. They do not appear in school textbooks. They do not appear in the speeches given on military holidays. They appear, when they appear at all, as a number. 97.4%. The number is a memorial of a kind. It is the only memorial that has survived. It says, more accurately than any monument could say, what happened to them. They were sent into a wilderness by a government that was not ready to send them. They were led by men who were not ready to lead them. They were attacked by an enemy that was ready and trained and waiting. And they died, almost all of them, in a single morning. The Western Confederacy that killed them won the battle. It did not win the war. The republic that had failed them rebuilt itself, rebuilt its army, returned to the same forests 3 years later, and conquered the territory that the Wabash had briefly seemed to deny it. The transformation that the catastrophe forced was the transformation that made the conquest possible. History does not always run in straight lines. Sometimes the worst defeats produce the most lasting changes. Sometimes the forgotten battles are the foundational ones. Sometimes the men who die in obscurity are the men whose deaths matter most. The Wabash matters. It matters because it happened. It matters because of what came after. It matters because the institutional structures it forced into existence have shaped every American war fought since. It matters because 920 men stood in a frozen meadow at dawn on November 4th, 1991, and only 24 of them walked away. The other 896 paid in a single morning for the failures of a republic that had not yet learned how to lead an army. The republic learned. The price was paid. The bones rest at Fort Recovery. And the meadow, 235 years after the morning that defined it, is quiet again.